sure there's a teacher back there. Or Ava. You would please be turning your Bibles to Acts chapter 17. Acts 17, I want to read just a moment there before we move into where we are in the 46th, 7th, and 8th chapter of Isaiah. So chapters Isaiah 40 through 48 are the beginning of the second half of the book. And we talked about that. God makes a statement. I want to be your comforter, but in order for me to be your comforter, you have to fear me. You also have to trust me. He starts out making his point, we saw in the 40th chapter, by saying, number one, that I made the world. I made it all by myself. I didn't need anybody to help me. I made the entire world. Secondly, he began talking about, I can foretell the future accurately. So he uses example after example after example. In the 44th chapter, he mentions the name of a man who is called Cyrus, who would be a great Persian king 120 years before he was born. He tells his name specifically for that. In addition to that, he talks about comparing himself. This is Almighty God versus their idols. He's going to come back to that this evening. What you're going to see when you take a look at this is the last several chapters of it. The second part of this 8 chapters is his pronouncement against the nation of Babylon. We're going to talk about this tonight. Now, to open this up, I want to look at Acts chapter 17 for just a moment. So in Acts 17, the Apostle Paul, you can see is in verse 16, he was in Athens, and he was walking around noticing a city full of idols. Now, this is exactly what you see dealt with in the book of Isaiah. He even, as he begins his speech in verse 22, 17 and 22, Paul stood in the midst of the Areopagus and said, Men of Athens, I observe that you are very religious in all respects. He starts out with a positive note, and he says, For I was passing through and examining objects of your worship. I also found an altar with the inscription, To the unknown God. What do you think this inscription, from their thought process, what do you think this idol, that the name, it didn't have a name, it just said to the unknown God. What were they trying to accomplish, do you think, with this idol? To cover their bases. If they left one out anywhere, then they're going to cover it with this. Now, from that, he begins talking about, the Apostle Paul begins talking about exactly what's happening up here, and that is God versus their idols that they were accustomed to. But I want to look at one statement just for a moment. I quote this from time to time. Verse 24, the God who made the world and all things in it, since he is Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands. They had lots of those in the city that he was in many places. Neither is he served by human hands, as though he needed anything, since he himself gives all life and breath and all things. And he made from one every nation of mankind to live on the face of the earth, having determined their appointed times, and in verse 27, and the boundaries of their habitations. What you see in the book of Isaiah, in my judgment, more than any other book in the Bible, is that phrase. God determined the times and the boundaries of the habitations of these nations. When you take a look, as an example, in Isaiah chapter 10 and verse 5, where he says, Woe to Assyria, the rod of my indignation. He began talking about when Assyria got too arrogant, and he talked about that in detail. God said, I'm going to break you over my knee like a twig. He determined the times and the boundaries of their habitations. He brought in a nation called Babylon. You can see that in the 11th chapter. When you're studying this book, you see that Isaiah prophesied from around 740 BC to 690. Now, that's determined by he received his charter, if you will, or his call, the last year of the king Uzziah. So what you see is the king, his son Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. So what we were reading back in the 10th chapter, the 11th, 13th chapter about these nations was God telling way early in the time of Isaiah, telling Isaiah what was going to happen, and it was your job to tell the people. You remember when God said, who can I send? And Isaiah said, here am I, send me. Well, he did send him. Now, we're looking at many years downstream. By the time we've seen this, in about 725 BC, the nation of Assyria was gone. Assyria had already, by 721, I should say, not 5, had destroyed the northern kingdom. Shortly after that, they had been destroyed. By the time we're studying tonight, we're down here near the end of Isaiah's life, and in a little while, he is going to be talking to the nation of Babylon. As we read this in chapters 46, 7, and 8, I want you to think about God today talking to the president of our nation, and talking to the head of Russia, and talking to the head of Iraq, and Iran, and North Korea, and all of these nations. Is there any one of them that's too powerful for God to control? Is there a single one of them living now or that has ever lived that God didn't create them and their mama and daddy before them? And the answer is no. So what you see greater than anything is a manifestation of what Paul said when he says, God, you're looking at all these idols and you think these idols are so important. I'm going to tell you right now, God determines the times and the boundaries of the habitations. Now look very quickly before we have our opening prayer in Isaiah chapter 10. So this is early on when God was giving the command to Isaiah. This is what I want you to go tell the people. In a few chapters, he's going to talk about three world empires that God said they got too arrogant. They got too greedy. They had in the case of Babylon, they had no restraint when it came to destroying the two nations, the northern and southern nations of Israel. He says you had no compassion. And because of that, he destroyed him. Looks like I need new batteries. I've been feeling the last 2 weeks like I needed new batteries. I'm hoping it's hay fever. Well, let's just look in chapter 10 for just a moment. So in chapter 10, verse 5, woe to Assyria, the rod of my anger. So he begins talking about his arrogance. You remember in verse 15, he talked about, here's an axe that says to the tree, I'm going to cut you down. Well, the axe can't cut the tree down. The axe is just a tool. And that's exactly what you saw in the case of the Assyrian king. Now you take a look at, in the 13th chapter, let's see if I'm back on here, I am. All right, so chapter 13, if you were to look at 10:24, so this is the early part of God coming to Isaiah and telling him, this is what I want you to tell these people. So in 10 and 24, thus saith the Lord God of hosts, O my people who dwell in Zion, do not fear Assyria, who strikes you with the rod and lifts up his staff against you the way Israel did. For in a little, very little while, my indignation against them will be spent, and my anger will be directed toward their destruction. And that has already well since happened by the time of our reading tonight. Look in chapter 13. 13 and 1. The oracle concerning Babylon, when Isaiah the son of Amoz saw that. Now take a look in verse 5. They are coming far from a country, the Lord and his instrument of indignation to destroy the whole land. Wail, for the day of the Lord is near. It will come as destruction from the Almighty. This is Babylon. Look in verse 17. Behold, I'm going to stir up the Medes against them, who will not value silver or take pleasure in gold and all their bows and mow down the young men. They will not even have compassion on the fruit of the womb, nor pity the eye of the children. As Babylon, the beauty of kingdoms, the glory of the Chaldean pride, will be as when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. In 3 chapters here, the early days of Isaiah's ministry, God made it abundantly clear that I determine the times and the boundaries of the habitations of the nations. Nobody else does that. Tonight, we're going to see in clear detail the destruction of Babylon. It will not happen in Isaiah's life. It's not going to happen for a good way. But what God's doing is He's showing them, I can foretell the future. None of you can. You've never had an idol that would told you what was going to happen 10 or 20 years down the road and been accurate. By this time, Isaiah, being the mouthpiece of God, had already prophesied many, many, many things. And guess what? They all came to pass exactly like God said. So I want to pick up in just a moment with chapter 46. Chapter 46. We are finishing this last section, 40 through 48. So we will start in verse 46 in just a moment. Byron.
Dear Lord, for the opportunity you've given us to meet here tonight and study your word. Dear Lord, be with Brother Rick as he brings us the lesson tonight. And what he's saying be true from your word. May we be enriched by this. May it help us to be stronger Christians and to give a good example to others in our community. Dear Lord, be with us always. Forgive us of our sins. This we ask in Christ's name.
Amen. Chapter 46. The first verse of chapter 46, he lists the 2 most prominent idols of the Babylonians. Their names were Bel and Nebo. You can study them. A lot of material in the internet. I've looked at it. These were large idols that they carried around on their shoulders. And so he says, basically, these idols have enslaved men to become a beast of burden because they just carry them around and they haul them all over every place. And this was their pride when it came to being their gods. Look in chapter 46 and verse 1. Bel has bowed down. Nebo stooped over. Just stop for a moment. A story that I went through 6 months or so ago on Sunday night. I talked about a god, a false god, that they took the Ark of the Covenant and they brought it into the temple where this God was, and they set the Ark of the Covenant down. And the next morning, when people walked into the temple, what had happened? He was laying on his face, and they stood him back up. And the next day what happened was, they came in, his head had broken off, his hands had broken off. What was that God? Dagon. Very good. And he was the god of the nation of the Philistines. All right, so these are their gods. So he says, the thing that you carry are burdensome, a load as for a weary beast. They stooped over. They have bowed down together. They could not rescue the burden, but they have themselves gone into captivity. Listen to me, O house of Jacob, and all the remnant of Israel. You have been born by me from birth, and you have been carried from the womb. Even to your old age, I shall be the same. Just stop for a moment. Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 8 talks about Jesus Christ. And it says, Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. He will always be the same. God said, I've been with you when you were born, every one of you alive, and I'll be with you in your old age, and I don't change. Now stop for a minute and think about this. How often do we have a presidential election in this country? Every 4 years. So every 4 years, there's a pretty good chance that the whole direction we're going to go as a country changes. Right? And all of you here are old enough, you've seen that happen many times. And if the Lord lets you live another 20, 30, 40 years, you're going to see it another 8 to 10 times. Is it encouraging to you to think about God never changes? The rules don't change. The plans don't change. It's always the same. Now look at what he says here in verse 4. Even to your old age I shall be the same. Even as to your graying years I shall bear you. I have done it. I shall carry you. I shall bear you, and I shall deliver you. What's he talking about? What is the context? I told you from the very beginning in chapter 40 and verse 1, this word occurs several times, comfort. The last half, chapters 40 through 66, you can define as comfort. God is trying to comfort these people. And he says, you've got to respect me more than any king or anything else, and you've got to trust me. You've got to hold my hand and take. What he's doing here is he's making this case again. And what he's coming into is, I'm going to show you up close and personal what I'm going to do next. And what I'm going to do next is, I'm going to completely wipe out the nation that you're enslaved to right now. And I'm telling you in advance, it's going to happen. Now, yes, sir.
Talk about that. I was thinking about this the other day. That how when we change politicians, we change. What big church is it? One of the biggest churches that every time the leader dies or he decides to get too old to step down, they always start telling their changes they're making. You know who I'm talking about?
I think half a dozen. Absolutely.
Well, yeah, it's more and more doing it, but there's one large one.
Yeah.
When the Pope dies off,
Yeah.
always has change.
Yep, the new one is different from the last one, who was different from the one before. They're still human, I think. So take a look in verse 8. So he says in verse 3, listen to me. He's going to say again in verse 12, listen to me. Here in verse 8, he's saying, remember this. I'm making several points here. Here's the second point. And be assured, recall it to your mind, you transgressors. Remember the former things long past, for I am God, and there is no other. I am God, and there's no one like me, declaring the end from the beginning. He has done that all the time, in the time of Isaiah, telling them what was going to happen next and what was going to happen even 150 years down the road. He says in the latter part of verse 10, and from ancient times things which have not been done, saying, my purpose will be established. In Isaiah chapter 55, he talks about there, in fact, let's just turn there for a second, look at this. This will be a part of this story, Isaiah chapter 55. There is a portion of this that we quote all the time, but I want you to look right after it. Isaiah 55, beginning in verse 6. So what he's saying in verse 6 is, seek the Lord, this is Isaiah 55 and 6, where he may be found. Call on him when he is near. In verse 8, he says, my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither my ways your ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts higher than your thoughts. But this verse 11 is what I want you to look at. Look in verse 11. So shall my word be, which goes forth from my mouth, it shall not return to me empty. Now, a lot of people use empty words. A lot of people say things that they don't mean. A lot of people say things that they planned on doing it, and something happened where they couldn't do it. God says, it doesn't happen with me. Without accomplishing what I have desired and without succeeding in the matter which I sent it. Now, let's go back now to verse 11, 46 and 11. So God, in the 55th chapter, is making the same case. You can trust me. You can count on me. Now he says this in verse 11. Calling a bird of prey from the east, the man of my purpose from a far country. Truly I have spoken, truly I will bring it to pass. That man, we saw his name in 44:28 and 45:1. Cyrus was his name. That's the bird of prey that's going to be coming. In verse 12, listen to me. How many of you have ever said that to a kid? A child or a grandchild? I had a grandmother that when I was about 10 years old, me and my cousin, a year older than me, would go spend a few weeks or a month with them. And when she wanted to get our attention, she grabbed us by the cheek. Listen to me. That was her way of getting our attention. So verse 12, listen to me, you stubborn-minded, who are far from righteousness. I bring near my righteousness. It is not far off, and my salvation will not delay. And I will grant salvation to Zion and my glory for Israel. So we've been talking about now, really since the 2nd chapter, the mountain of the Lord's house will be established in Zion, and people will come, stream to it, say, let us come, that we may learn of the Lord. You see it in chapter 7, chapter 9, chapter 11, chapter 13. In this, we see the 2 remnants. And I've made the point even this last Sunday morning. This is remnant number 1. And that is that we studied the book of Ezra, what was going to happen, the 70 years where they would be scattered throughout the world. And then a man named Cyrus would bring them all back. But now he's talking about something much further downstream. In chapter 2, the law will go forth from Mount Zion. Where was Mount Zion? In Jerusalem. It was a very well-known mountain. That was the mountain of the Lord's house. There was going to be a world empire formed that would not come and go like the Medes and Persians, not like the Babylonians, not like the Assyrians. This was going to be one that was going to last forever, and it would be superior to all other world empires. So the latter part of chapter 46 here, what he's saying is, not only am I telling you that I'm going to take care of this Babylonian king, I'm bringing a bird of prey, I'm telling you, even those of you that are old, stay with me. I'm going to bring about something that you've never seen on this earth before. I had probably had more comments from people after the class where we talked about the lion would lay down with the lamb. You remember that? And we talked about how a child would play with a cobra. Many other things he talked about. And what I said to you was, that was mortal enemies becoming friends and working together. You travel around this country, around this world, and you will find pretty quick churches of the Lord's people made up of more nations and more backgrounds than you can imagine in the world. And in many cases, nations that fought one another. Here a while back, Linda and I were in Edinburgh, Scotland on a Sunday, and there was the preacher there was a retired military and good congregation of people, probably 120. I'll tell you this quick story. We drove up in a little car, and there was about 8 cars out front. So we thought, well, this is a little group. Wrong answer. None of them had cars. There was 150 people in that group, or well north of 100. But there were people there from all over the world, meeting in the same house, friends with one another. Now that's exactly what he was talking about when he says in verse 13, I will bring my righteousness, it is not far off, and my salvation will not delay, and I will grant salvation in Zion and my glory for Israel. Now look in verse 47 as he moves into the next part of this. Come down and sit in the dust, O virgin of Babylon. Sit on the ground without a throne, O daughters of the Chaldeans. For you shall no longer be called tender and delicate. These people were arrogant and they had it made. But look what he says. Take the millstone and grind meal. Remove the veil. Strip the skirt. Uncover the leg. Cross the river. Your nakedness will be uncovered and your shame will be exposed. He's beginning to talk about the destruction of this nation. And he's going to tell them in intricate detail why this happened. So just like the Assyrians, he has determined the time and the boundaries of the habitation of this nation of people. And he's telling them in advance why that's going to happen. Now look a little bit further. See if you can see what the problem was as God saw it. So imagine God having a conversation with the city of Babylon and that empire. In verse 5, sit silently and go in darkness, O daughters of Chaldean, for you will no more be called the queen of kingdoms. This is 4 things. This is the first one. I was angry with my people, the nation of Judah and Israel. I was angry with them. I profaned my heritage and gave them into your hand. You did not do what? What does he say? Here was the concern. They didn't show mercy. I gave this nation, my people, put them in your hand, Nebuchadnezzar. I even told in Jeremiah chapter 27, every nation in the world, you must listen to Nebuchadnezzar and do what he says to do. And Nebuchadnezzar was a good king. His son, however, was worthless. So in Daniel chapter 5, we've talked about this before. After the hand comes out of the wall and writes on the wall, they're sitting there drinking these chalices that came from the temple. And Daniel said to them, okay, this is what that says. What that says is you're done. You're going to die tonight. And he did. And in that chapter, the last verse of Daniel chapter 5, Darius the Mede, this is the one that we've talked about, would take over. So this happened quickly. Now this is going to come up in the text. Now look at this with me. So look at what he says. Verse 5. You will no longer be called the Queen of Kingdoms. I was angry with my people. I profaned my heritage, and I gave them into your hand. You did not show mercy to them. On the aged you made your yoke very heavy. Yet you said, I shall be queen forever. What would cause somebody to say that? Arrogance. How many of you think that the United States of America is a pretty arrogant nation? Especially to other nations around the world. We will be the big kahuna forever. And God says, really? So look at what he says. In verse 5, he says in verse 5, the latter part, you will no more be called the queen of the kingdoms. Verse 7, you said, I shall be a queen forever. These things you did not consider, nor did you remember the outcome of them. Now then, hear this, the sensual ones who dwell securely, who say in your heart, I am, and there is no one beside me. If you were to read that verse, you would think that that was God talking about himself. This was the leaders of the nation of Babylon. He says this, verse 3, I am, and there is no one beside me. I shall not sit as a widow, nor shall I have no loss of children. Nothing bad's going to happen to me, like what we did to the Assyrian nation and what we did to the nation of Israel and what we did to all of these others. Nobody is ever going to do that to us. I remember in high school, I think, but certainly in college, taking government classes and world history classes, and what we would talk about was we in America had it made. We had it made. Here's why. We got oceans on both sides of us, and we got friends to the north and friends to the south. Nobody can touch us. Now, you load up several airplanes in Logan, and you fly them a couple of 100 miles to the south, and you bring down 2 massive buildings, and you kill 3,800 people. And in retrospect, it didn't seem like that hard. It's like, why didn't we see that? Isn't that amazing? Now, all of a sudden, we're all quite nervous, aren't we? Because this great wall had been breached. Look at what he says about them. So he says, they said in the latter part of verse 8, I am, and there's no one beside me. I shall not sit as a widow, nor shall I have loss of children. God says in verse 9, but these 2 things, the 2 things that you said over and over about yourselves, shall come on you suddenly in one day. Loss of children and widowhood. They shall come on you in full measure in spite of your many sorceries, in spite of the great power of your spell. And you felt secure in your wickedness, and you said, no one sees me. Your wisdom and your knowledge, they have deluded you. You think that happens commonly to human beings? Their wisdom and their knowledge had fooled them. into a false sense of security. What would you think today tends to make us, the United States of America, be so arrogant toward every other nation in the world? What would you say causes that?
The Lord has blessed us with so much, so much protection, like you just brought out. Yeah, we did have to make for some time when there was more people that had turned their back on God.
Mm-hmm.
That's what's caused it. People turn from God. He didn't leave us, we left him. Well, I say we haven't talked about the general. He does still have some, quite a few, but not as many as there used to be.
Earlier generations worked to build something, later generations are still entitled to what other people earn.
Well, Shelby and I were at a seminar up at the steakhouse in Houston a week ago, and this professor from SMU was talking about the future for this nation as he saw it. And it was an interesting thing. He put up there, he said, if you take people who make in excess of $50,000 a year, I think it was, household income, I want to give you a statistic. So here was this long stream of blue people, and he says, this is the United States of America. Here is Great Britain, 1. Here is France, 1. So this is relatively speaking. We basically have about 80% of all of the wealth of the world right here. So that tends to make us a little arrogant, like, well, by my might and by my power we built these things. That's what God said in Deuteronomy 8. I do not want you to believe. The second thing is, when's the last time we lost a war militarily? I heard this a couple of days ago, and maybe it's okay. I don't know. Do not underestimate the power of the United States of America. Said by our president in South Korea. And he made the statement there, sometime before, if you mess with us, we'll wipe out the whole country. Maybe we will, and maybe we won't. It depends on God determining the time and the habitations of the nation, the boundaries. Now look a little bit further in verse 11. For you, the latter part of verse 10, for you have said in your heart, I am, and there's no one besides me. But even when evil comes upon you, which you do not know how to charm away, so you can't make this go away, and disaster will fall on you, which you alone you cannot atone, and destruction upon you, which you do not know, will come on you suddenly. Stand fast now with your spells and with your many sorceries, with which you have labored from your youth. Perhaps you will be able to profit. Perhaps you may cause trembling. You have wearied with so many counsels. Let the astrologers who prophesy by the stars and let those predict by new moons stand up and save you from what will come upon you. Behold, they have become like stubble. Fire burns them. They cannot deliver themselves from the power of the flame. All of these great and brilliant people. Look in verse 15 now. So have those become to you whom you have labored, who have trafficked with you from your youth. Each have wandered in his own way. There is none to save you. All of their plans. There's one thing that I heard a gentleman talk about a number of years ago in a seminar that I thought was interesting. He asked the question, who invented the airplane? What country? The United States, the Wright brothers. Who invented the automobile? That would be us. Many other things. Who invented the computer? Who invented the internet? Al Gore. All right. So now, so in our lifetime, we can't even compete with most of those, can we? When it comes to airplanes, when it comes to automobiles, when it comes to computers, when it comes to the internet, when it comes to so much technology, we have a hard time in one generation even competing with the Chinese and the Japanese and Koreans and so many others. But that's our source of strength, our money and our military and our technology. We've got more than everybody else. How could we be touched? Now, chapter 48, I want to spend just a moment on this. We've got about 5 minutes left. He's now gone from talking to the nation of Babylon as if God were having a conversation with this nation to, in verse 1, the nation of Israel. And he says this, "Hear, O house of Israel, who are named Israel, and who come forth from the loins of Judah, who swore by the name of the Lord, and invoked the God of Israel, but not in truth nor in righteousness." What does that mean to you? So somebody calls on the Lord. They invoke the name of the Lord. How many people today have you heard say, "Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, OMG, OMG, OMG"? And half of them, if not more, maybe 90 or 100%, have not a clue who God is. Or somebody says, "Jesus Christ." So they invoke the name of God, but not in righteousness, he said, his own people. Verse 2, "For they call themselves after the holy city, and lean on the God of Israel. The Lord of hosts is his name. I declare the former things long ago." I told you a long time ago. Even, it would have been close to 50 years ago that he said it through the mouth of Isaiah, when Isaiah first became his prophet in chapter 6. Now look a little bit further here. And what we see in verse 3, "I declare the former things long ago, and they went forth from my mouth, and I proclaimed them. Suddenly I acted, and they came to pass, because I know that you are obstinate, and your neck is as iron sinews, and your forehead bronze. Therefore I declared them long ago. I gave you plenty of warning. But they took place, I proclaimed them to you, lest you should say, my idols have done them." He wanted to be sure. I'm claiming credit for this 20, 30, 50 years before it happened, so you don't have to worry about where it came from. "And my graven images," he says, the latter part of verse 5, "and my molten images have commanded them. You have heard like all of this, and you will not declare it." You know it, you've heard it, but you don't believe it. Verse 7, "They are created now and not long ago, and before today you have not heard them." Let's go down to verse 12. "Listen to me," he says again, "O Jacob, even Israel whom I called. I am he. I am the first and I am the last. Surely my hand founded the earth, and my right hand has spread out the heavens. When I call them, they stand together. Assemble, all of you, and listen. Who among you has declared these things? The Lord loves him. He has carried out his good pleasure on Babylon." He's done what he planned on doing. "And his arm shall be against the Chaldeans. Even I have spoken. Indeed, I have called him. I have brought him. He will make his way successful." Verse 17, "Thus saith the Lord, your Redeemer, the Holy One of Israel. I am the Lord your God, who teaches you to profit." How do you think God teaches us how to profit? How do you develop, just for you to think about for a moment, how do you develop great lifelong friends? By buying them stuff, right? Giving money to them all the time. How do you develop great long-term friends that are going to be with you through thick and thin? How do you do that? Every one of you know that, and you've done it. So God teaches us how to profit. He teaches us how to see money properly. He teaches us how to have good marriages and have good families. Now look at this. He goes further. He says, verse 17, the latter part, "I am the Lord your God, who teaches you to profit, who leads you in the ways that you should go. If only I had paid attention to you had paid attention to my commandments, then your well-being would have been like a river, and your righteousness like the waves of the sea. Your descendants would have been like the sand." They were at one time. We saw that in the early part of this book. "And your offspring like its grain. Their name would never be cut off or destroyed from my presence. Go forth from Babylon. Flee from the Chaldeans. Declare the sound of joyful shouting. Proclaim this. Send it out to the end of the earth, says the Lord has redeemed his servant Jacob, And they did not thirst when he led them through the desert. He made waters flow out like the rock from them. He split the rock. When did all this happen? When they were in the desert, the time of Moses. The water gushed forth. There is no peace for the wicked, saith the Lord. So he finishes this chapter by saying, I'm going to wipe out Babylon. And when I do, this is what we've been talking about. I'm going back the last several classes. You're going to have 70 years of captivity. And then Israel and Jerusalem will be inhabited again. Here's Jerusalem. Here's the nation of Israel. That's the time of Cyrus that you see in chapter 44 and 45. It will be rebuilt, God said. There will be people living in this city again. You can believe it because I said it. Now that's what he's talking about in this last verse. After he takes the boot of Babylon off their neck, he will make them a great nation again. All right. I went through a lot of material. Comments or questions. This is what you see in these chapters. Now we're moving into the last two pieces. There's 66 chapters. We have 16 chapters left to go. Sunday morning, Lord willing, I want to talk about chapters 50. We're going to touch 49, but 50 through 52 is where we will be the next week or so. God is saying, you need to fear me more than you fear your boss, more than you fear your family, more than you fear false gods, and trust me. Just do what I tell you to do. All right, any comments? All right, so we will pick up chapter 49, Lord willing, Sunday morning. This is a chapter that's got a lot of New Testament quotes in it that we will look at.